Hello, my name is Derek Atkins, and this is part one of the video lecture on race, gender, and diversity. This video lecture is for the course Church, Society, and Ethical Issues in Asia at the East Asia School of Theology. Part one will deal with race and gender, while part two will deal with diversity. So let's begin our lecture. When I was younger, I believed that much progress was being made in race relations. There were still prejudices between different races, and progress still needed to be made, but I did feel that things were much better than they had been previously. However, during the past 10 to 15 years, I feel that race relations have gotten much worse, and this saddens me. We've seen race riots in the US, such as the riots in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, as well as the widespread riots that took place in 2020 following the death of Floyd George at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Nor are these problems found only in the United States. There have been riots between different tribes in Northeast India. There was the 1994 genocide of Tutsis by Hutus in Rwanda, which saw the death of more than 800,000 civilians. There has been the ethnic cleansing of Rohingyas by Myanmar's military regime, and there have been the deaths of some 300,000 non-Arab civilians in Darfur by the Arab regime of Sudan in 2003, among others. In many other places, there are tensions between different ethnic groups, such as tensions between the natives Maoris and descendants of non-Maori immigrants in New Zealand, between Aborigines and non-Aborigines in Australia, the ongoing conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, and the Russo-Ukrainian War. All of these conflicts raise the question, how should we as Christians understand and respond to these conflicts? Let's look at what the Bible says about these kinds of conflicts and how they can be resolved. First, we need to distinguish between the terms race and ethnicity, because while these two terms are often used interchangeably, they are not the same. Race is a sociological term that has been created to establish different castes of superior and inferior races. Think of how African Americans, Native Americans, Latin Americans, and even Asian Americans have at times been separated from Caucasian Americans and discriminated against as inferior. Worse yet, think of how Nazi Germans attempted to systematically exterminate all non-Aryans because of their explicit definition of Aryans as a superior race. Other examples of how race has been used to justify discrimination against inferior races include apartheid in South Africa. Then there is the term ethnicities. Ethnicities, on the other hand, are people groups created by God as they move together through time and space. This term is found in the Bible itself, for the New Testament uses the Greek word ethne to describe nations and people groups, and is often translated as nation. However, it is important to note that the Bible's use of the word nation is very different from how we use this word today, because the modern nation state as we know it came into existence only with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. In Jesus' day, the Roman Empire was a collection of many different ethnic groups. The same is true of other ancient empires, such as the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Greek Empire. At the end of the day, there is only one race. We see this truth in Acts 17, 26 to 27, where the Apostle Paul affirms that every human who is living or has ever lived descended from Adam and Eve. Paul also affirmed that God is the one who has created every ethnicity. Paul used the word ethnos, which is translated as nation in English Bibles. We also see reference to these ethnic groups journeying together through time and space, as Paul speaks of how God actively determined the time and exact places where they should live. This means that we are actually one race, the human race. When it comes to skin color, there's a very wide spectrum of skin colors, from very dark skin to very light skinned. Physically, there are no real differences between races. For example, we have the same blood, and in fact, we can donate blood to one another irrespective of our race or ethnicity. Likewise, we are also able to physically mate with one another with no difficulty, because we are all one race. We are a single species. However, the Bible does speak a good deal about different ethnic groups. As we saw earlier, the Greek word for nation is ethne, which is often better translated as ethnic group, people group, or even tribe. For example, Genesis 10, which occurs chronologically after the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, shows how the human race began to scatter into different groups across the whole world. In fact, a close reading of Genesis 11 indicates that those who came together to build the Tower of Babel were disobeying God's earlier instruction in Genesis 1:28 and Genesis 9:1 to fill the earth. Thus, we see that God's original design for humanity was that there should be ethnic variation among humans. Sinful humanity mistakenly assumed that ethnic variation would always result in disunity, and thus they rebelled against God's instruction by coming together at Babel to create an alternate worship site. The great irony is that by disobeying God, sinful humans provoked God into confusing their languages and thereby brought about the very disunity they sought to prevent. Since then, human sin has transformed God's original design of unity in diversity into a tremendous source of division. We see evidence throughout the Bible and the historical record of hostility between different ethnic groups. In many instances, this hostility has erupted into physical violence between different people groups, or has manifested itself in different forms of oppression, such as caste structures, slavery, and discrimination. Fortunately, the Bible story doesn't end there, because our God is a God of reconciliation. Following the breaking up of humanity after the Tower of Babel, God began a new stage in his plan of redemption by calling Abraham to follow him in a covenant of relationship, and through Abraham's descendants to create the Jewish people who would go on to bless all the families of the earth. This is found in Genesis 12:3. As part of his covenant relationship with Abraham, God made a series of promises, including a promise that Abraham would become the father of a family composed of many different cultures and ethnicities. See Genesis 12:3 and Galatians 3:7-9. This covenant promise continued throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament. See also Genesis 15, verses 1-5, where God repeats this promise to Abraham. Over time, the Jews became a very exclusionary people, drawing a sharp boundary between themselves and the Gentiles. The term Gentile refers to anyone who is not a Jew. While there were valid reasons for this sharp boundary between Jews and Gentiles, human sinfulness changed this boundary from a good thing into a harmful practice. Eventually, hostility between Jews and Gentiles grew as Jews adopted an us versus them mindset. The fact that Jews faced several existential crises at the hands of the Egyptians, Persians, and promoters of Hellenistic culture did not improve matters much either. With Christ's death and resurrection, a new covenant was begun. Part of this new covenant includes the promise in Ephesians 2:14 that Jesus has removed the barrier of hostility that divided Jews from Gentiles. Through faith in Jesus, all of us, both Jews and Gentiles, can become part of God's eternal family. At the same time, Galatians 3:28 indicate that Jesus doesn't erase ethnic differences. In fact, Revelation 7 verses 9 and 10 seem to indicate that ethnic differences will still exist in heaven, including different languages. The New Testament writers go on to teach that God doesn't show partiality toward people, nor should we. See Romans 2:11 and James 2:9. Romans 10 verses 12 and 13 also state that God doesn't make distinctions between different ethnic groups. This means that any kind of racial or ethnic discrimination is sinful. As the children's Sunday school song says, Jesus loves the children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Throughout Asia, almost every country has a mix of different ethnic groups. This ethnic diversity often creates tensions within different nations and even between different nations. These include tensions between Taiwanese Aboriginals and Han Taiwanese, tensions between Han Chinese and other ethnic groups within China, such as the Uyghurs, as well as past conflict between Cambodia and Vietnam. Even Singapore experienced race riots in 1964, an experience that still informs Singapore's ongoing effort to promote harmony between the different ethnic groups that live within Singapore. Oftentimes, conflicts between different ethnic groups arise because of perceptions that governments are giving one ethnic group preferential treatment over another for certain services or benefits, or that governments are preventing certain ethnic groups from enjoying benefits and services such as education, housing, healthcare, and employment. In still other cases, there are perceptions that governments are demonstrating outright hostility toward certain ethnic groups in areas such as the justice system or voting rights. This is why biblical teachings about not showing partiality are so important. Governments should treat all citizens equally in all aspects of policies. This teaching about non-partiality also applies to those who are not government employees, such as teachers, doctors and nurses, police officers, business people, and even shopkeepers. One of the key aspects of Christian living is how we treat others. In the Golden Rule, Jesus himself commands us to treat others the way we want to be treated. How we treat others is a crucial test of our relationship with Christ and can affect how others view Christianity. Now, let's talk about gender. There are a number of contemporary gender issues. The first of these is the wage gap. In most countries around the world, women typically earn less than men. This is true in both developing and developed countries. Here are some international comparisons. All of these comparisons will be stated in terms of $1 US. So in South Korea, women earn 68.8 cents to every dollar that men make. In the Philippines, that figure is 71.6 cents. In Japan, women earn 78.7 cents for every dollar men earn. And in Cambodia, women earn 81 cents compared to every dollar men make. In Canada, that figure rises to 82.2 cents for every dollar men make. In the United States, women earn 83 cents compared to every dollar men make. In Singapore, that figure goes up to 85.7 cents. In Vietnam, women earn 86.3 cents for every dollar men earn. And believe it or not, in Thailand, women earn 101.5 cents compared to every dollar Thai men earn. So in Thailand, women actually earn more than men in certain occupations. In some countries, this wage gap is due to traditional gender roles. Another factor contributing to the wage gap is the reality that many women leave the labor force after giving birth to children. When women re-enter the workforce after caring for their children, they lack the experience that many of their male colleagues gained during the years that the women were outside of the workforce. Yet another factor is that women and men often choose to work in different professions. Obvious examples include military service, which is dominated by men, and nursing, which continues to be dominated by women. Another contemporary gender issue is the feminization of poverty. Women are at greater risk of living in poverty than men. There are multiple reasons for this, including divorce. Typically, men's economic condition improves after divorce, while women's economic condition worsens following divorce. While improvements in education and wages have made divorce a more economically viable option for many women, the reality remains that women typically fare worse economically after divorce. Other reasons for the feminization of poverty include a lack of educational opportunities for girls, especially in certain parts of the world. One major consequence of the feminization of poverty is that as women experience poverty, so do any children who may be living with them. When divorce does occur, women are almost always given custody of their children. In other cases, women who have children as a result of live-in boyfriends are often abandoned by their boyfriend following breakups or other disruptive events. Another group of women who experience significant poverty is elderly women. One unfortunate reality is that widows are often targeted by unscrupulous financial predators who cheat them out of their pensions or life insurance payments. Even those widows who are fortunate enough to escape financial predators often still face significant reductions in income following retirement and or the deaths of their husbands. Given the high cost of medical care, living on a fixed income can become a heavy burden for elderly women. This is one of the reasons why one of the categories of injustice that the Bible explicitly mentions is the mistreatment of widows. Another problem that women face is the lack of educational opportunities. In many parts of the world, girls lack the opportunity to attend school. In some countries, such as Afghanistan, this is because religious beliefs and practices forbid girls from attending school altogether or after a certain number of years. In other countries, the lack of basic necessities, such as access to clean water, means that when it comes to choosing who attends school, girls often miss out. Even when girls can receive an education, they still lag behind boys in many areas of educational achievement. In many countries, this education gap between men and women widens in secondary school and in high school, and even more during university and graduate studies. This lack of educational opportunities can and often does lead to a later lack of economic opportunities. However, in some countries, such as the United States, many schools have been so aggressive in promoting educational opportunities for girls that increasing numbers of boys are now having difficulties in achieving educational benchmarks in their own academic studies. Another problem that many women face is the glass ceiling. In some professions, women face barriers to advancement. For example, it has often been noted that there are far fewer women who are CEOs or who sit on the board of directors in corporations. Around the world, there has been an effort to see more women occupy elected offices or other certain professions that have traditionally been male-dominated, such as science, medicine, and even the military. In many cases, women entering professional roles today arouses little, if any, controversy in fields such as medicine and law, for example. But it is still controversial for women to enter other professions, especially military services, where performance standards are typically modified for female soldiers, raising questions about the combat effectiveness of women. Now, one argument that feminists sometimes make is that if a majority or even all of the world's nations were led by women, there would be a significant reduction in military conflicts or possibly even a complete cessation of wars. But if one looks at the historical record, one might question this assumption. For example, in the late 1400s, Queen Isabella of Spain, who later financed Christopher Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic Ocean, was deeply involved in the decades-long Granada War, which ended with the fall of Granada in 1492. In 1588, Queen Elizabeth I of England saw England through the decisive battles that surrounded the Spanish Armada's attempt to conquer England. While it was Philip II of Spain who launched this armada, it can be argued that Queen Elizabeth provoked Philip II by commissioning Sir Francis Drake and other British privateers to carry out raids on Spanish ships and ports, together with her execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic queen whose execution led directly to the Spanish Armada. Then in 1971, Indira Gandhi of India strongly supported Bangladesh's independence movement and took India to war against Pakistan to achieve this goal. And in 1982, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of England made the decision to respond militarily to Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands and was credited with maintaining the political will to see the Falkland War through to a successful conclusion. So this idea that if the majority of the world's leaders were women, that there would be fewer wars or maybe even a complete cessation of wars might not be such an accurate assumption after all. But there is a very serious problem that many women face, and that problem is gender-based violence. This category includes many different issues, such as child marriage. This practice often occurs in Muslim-majority nations as well as in India. Child marriage can lead to a loss of educational opportunities, a higher risk of death in childbirth for both the mother and her child, and increased risk of domestic violence. There's also the category of female genital mutilation, or FGM. This is another practice that often takes place in Muslim-majority nations. This involves a surgical procedure that is designed to remove or cover part of a woman's genital area. Those who practice FGM often claim that this is done to protect a woman's virginity, but this practice is quite harmful to women's health. And then there is domestic violence. Sadly, domestic violence occurs in all countries. Domestic violence can involve family members or someone whom one is dating. Domestic violence can include physical violence, such as hitting someone or rape, emotional abuse, or even economic abuse, such as withholding money or using money to gain control over another person. So in this slide, we have a picture of two couples. Then these two couples are of child brides and their husbands in Yemen. So let's look at biblical teaching about gender. The first thing I want to say is that God created us male and female. We find this truth in Genesis 1:27. This means that gender is not a social construct like race is. It is a biological reality that God Himself imprinted upon each human. Different cultures may have different ideas about how men and women should act and the roles they have, but gender itself is part of God's creation design. The second truth the Bible affirms is that the fall has damaged the image of God within us, including how our genders image God. We see this in Genesis 3:16, when God tells Eve, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain, you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. There is debate about what exactly this verse means, but most Christians agree that this verse teaches that the fall has distorted God's design for men and women, including how men and women relate to one another. A third truth that the Bible teaches is that men and women are equal before God. This has two elements. The first is that men and women are equally fallen. Adam and Eve both bear equal responsibility for disobeying God. Eve may have eaten the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil first, but it is very likely that Adam was standing right next to her the entire time. Even if this speculation is not correct, Adam still bears just as much responsibility for disobeying as God as Eve does. So that's one half of this truth. The other half is that men and women are equally loved by God and equally included in His plan of redemption. John 3:16 makes no distinction between men and women, and Galatians 3:28 makes this truth explicit, stating that God does not play favorites between men and women when it comes to redeeming fallen humanity. God judges and redeems men and women equally. And the fourth truth that the Bible says about men and women is that men and women have different roles. While men and women are equal before God, they do have different roles. For example, when it comes to marriage, Paul commands women to submit to their husband and for husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church. That is, husbands are to practice a sacrificial kind of love for their wives. See Ephesians 5, verses 22 through 33. Paul also clearly teaches that the husband is the head of the house. This role may look different at different times and in different culture, but God's design is for men to be the head of their families. There is debate among Christians about whether women are allowed to be pastors or not, but the Bible is clear that women can and do play a vital role in the life of the church. Jesus was supported financially by a number of women during his ministry, and it was women who first encountered the risen Lord. Jesus also related to women in very countercultural ways that affirm their dignity. The major implication of biblical teaching about genders is that men and women are to treat one another with respect and live out their lives according to God's design. Church history gives abundant evidence of how Christian teachings have greatly improved the lives of women throughout the world. In Jesus' day, female infanticide was very common in the Roman Empire, leading to a gross imbalance between men and women of 140 men for every 100 women. This practice was also common in ancient Greece in the centuries before Christ's coming. From its earliest days, Christian teaching condemned such practices as abortion and female infanticide, or any infanticide for that matter. It was common for Christians to find and adopt girls who were exposed, which is how infanticide was practiced in ancient Greece and Rome. Because of Christianity, equality for women is a common standard in the Western world and in many other countries as well. As Christian missionaries advanced the gospel, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, Christian missionaries, many of whom were not incidentally women, including many single women, successfully advocated for an end to such women-hostile practices as foot binding in China, the suicide of widows on the funeral pyres of their deceased husbands in India, female genital mutilation in Africa, polygamy in many parts of the world, and the lack of education, especially for girls. In these and in many other ways, biblical teaching on gender has led to incredible improvement in living conditions and opportunities for women in many, many parts of the world. Those examples of suppression of women's rights by Christians are contrary to the Bible's teaching and should not be regarded as normative. So we've looked at issues surrounding race and gender. Now we're going to move on to talk about issues surrounding diversity. So please go to video number 2 of this video lecture, and we will look at issues surrounding diversity.